So welcome to Nisargadatta teaching group. This is our first little encounter, I call it a satsang. Appreciate you guys jumping in, um, I thought maybe I'd just give you a really quick bio. I don't a lot of you don't know me, so I'll give you just a little piece of background, not a ton. It's a pretty standard issue. Um, I was raised in kind of a normal way. In fact, my mother converted to Mormonism when I was a kid, so I actually did a Mormon mission and was part of that whole thing, and went into the corporate world and kind of figured that's where I would spend the rest of my life. And when I was about 30 years old, I caught this thing called the seeking bug. I'm not sure what else you would call it, but I looked out there and I said, "There's something else going on." and I want to know what that is. That's about all I was armed with, by the way, was that particular notice. But it worked in me in such a way that it was a relentless kind of thing that pushed me into really, becoming, as we would call it, a seeker. I spent years living my life in metaphysical bookstores and doing that. And one day I heard a fellow speak about the ego, and when I heard that, I knew he knew it. So I got on a plane, and a couple weeks later, and I flew to India and Mumbai, and went from Mumbai up to Pune. And the fellow's name's Osho, for those of you who have heard of Osho before. And I spent the next 3 years pretty solidly in the ashram, and actually a biggest piece of another 4 years after that. So had quite a thing going on, and um, came back to the U.S. And one day somebody said to me, "Hey, um, do you know about Advaita?" Now, in today's world, you got to realize we have non-duality, which is how we refer to it now. But in those days, I had been exposed to a very little known thing called Advaita, and nobody else even had a clue what that meant or was. It certainly wasn't in anyone's conversation. And so, upon my next return to India, I had already gone through a huge shift in my own world, the awakening shift. And the one who was largely responsible for that was Ramesh Balsekar, who was in Mumbai at the time. And so I went over, and I just had the lucky thing. I'm an old merger acquisition guy, and Ramesh is an old bank president. He was the president of the Bank of India. And so he thought that was fun. And so I got to go to Satsang in the morning and spend afternoons having tea with him. And so we became quite close. And I always remember that he was the one that would tell me. He said, it's you folks that are going to kind of create what the emergence of non-duality or Advaita is in the West. He said, because the West has borrowed from us for all of these years, and he said, now it's time to self-create, because the culture needs to have its own version. I thought that was great. So then as we went along, I've taught now for the last 25 years, but I would just watch what was going on in our Western world as the non-dual piece emerged. And what I noticed was that as Westerners, we were grabbing onto it, but we were imprinting it with an incredible amount of our own conditioning. So that when I would go to a thread or something in social media and it was a non-dual thread, it was just the same kind of a food fight that they were having in every other social media thread. It was just that they were using words like consciousness and awareness and pronouncing a lot of things. And so I was speaking with Michael some time back, and I told him, I said I would read these threads and I would see people come in, and they would be just incredibly, I sense that they were incredibly vulnerable, and they would ask questions that a seeker would ask. And it just would break my heart, because the minute that their comment was out there, the vultures would descend and start to beat them around in the thread. And what it did is it made me go back to the days, when I would, stand across the street from Ramesh's little place, and we would get on the elevator and go upstairs, and we would sit in his front room, and there was a rocking chair in there from his garden, which I used to like to sit in. Everybody knew that. but there was a sense in the environment of that we were there and being held. And so that's the piece that I think that was really important to me when we started this group. I just wanted to create a place where people, if they wanted to have an experience of the non-dual conversation, the awakening conversation, that they could come to a place where um, they weren't going to be schooled around what consciousness was versus awareness or some picky thing along that particular line. Um, and it kind of brings up a thing, today I wanted to speak from the third chapter, which is about presence or the present actually. And I have to stick my face in front of my iPad here to get what I want to get up here, but it was really something, to take a look at that little particular piece, because what I was able to see is that and what he talks about in this chapter is how the conditioning of being an individual human being is so profound that it obscures everything else about us. So even though we intuitively know that there's something underneath, there's something we're looking for, that just can't be seen, because as an individual persona, we cover the whole spectrum, or if you will, the canvas. The canvas, if you will, could be awareness itself, holding the emergence of consciousness in the life as we see it, but that emergence was covering its own source. And so, to me, that's the thing about presence. And so what I notice in the Western conversation is that everybody is incredibly excited to have the revealing of a concept. So if you say, I am not the body, you'll get a whole bunch of folks that will say, I see that I'm not the body. And that's really great. That's the first step, right? That's the revealing moment that intellect unwinds a little something on the inside of who you are and says, there's something else you may not have considered. And that is, that if you can witness yourself, you can't be what it is that you witness. It just is and when you kind of sit with that for a minute, you're like, well, how could it be otherwise? That revelation becomes something that but then the revelation doesn't stop. And in today's world, that revelation is where people want to stop, because in the West, what we like to do is we like to grab onto revelation, and then we like to package it and send it out the back door so everybody else can see that we got the package. That's the conditioning of being certainly an American. And I'm from Southern California, so if you really want to find somebody who can package, market, and distribute something, they made us to do that. So I'm pretty sensitive when I see that happening. And in fact, my life history has a lot of exactly that in it, because I always thought that's what it was to be an incredibly successful human being. And so this packaging and delivery of newfound revelation is a big piece of what happened in my life. But Nisargadatta comes along, and what he says is that, look, if you just simply sit on the I am, right? Well, what happens when you sit on the I am? Because first of all, in this third one, what he's talking about is he's talking about the present and recognizing the present from anything else. And he says, you know the difference between now and anything else that you experience. It's easy. It's very simple, right? And even when you're thinking about the past or the future, what you're doing is migrating one of those two into place, right? And in that migration, the life that you're giving that story, if you will, the past or the present that you're remembering, is the presence that you are right now. And that's what makes a story a story. That's why when we say, hey, that story is really alive, then the aliveness, where does it come from? It comes from us.
Alan, can I step in 1 second here? Okay.
Yeah, sure. Go
Okay.
for it.
I was hearing a radio in the background and it was
Okay.
really distracting, but I think it's gone now, so I'll turn it back over
Yeah,
to you.
it
Sorry, that
is.
was me. I didn't know you could hear it because I was on
You
my
got your
phones.
earplugs in. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you.
sorry.
Thank you, sweetheart. So yeah, so all all I'm trying to point out is that what happens when one sits on the I am, because that's the extension or the remaining part of the revelation, if you will. So if the threads of who we are so large and tightly woven, the conditioning of being the individual that we are, and we believe that's all we are, and we see in Revelation this revealing intellectual thorn comes in and points out the fact that that's not the case, and that opens up for us. Well, then what happens is by sitting on the I am, is the threads of other concepts start to unwind around exactly that same observation and revelation, right? And it becomes that the sitting on the I am, right, becomes the process, if you will. And so what begins to happen is a rotation, if you will, of revelation and the unwinding of those particular threads. And so what then begins to happen is you then become the monitor of that, right? So if you're sitting on the I am and the unraveling is occurring and that's being witnessed, that's a wonderful thing. If what happens though is you start to jump on the podium and deliver the new sermon of non-duality and Advaita, then you may want to pull back on that and think for a minute, is this what's being asked for? So one of the things I just wanted to point out, here's just my advice, is that whenever you write something, because we've got the forum now, and we'll start and play in that forum. But whenever you write something into the forum, my suggestion is make sure whatever you write is in service of something. So if it's in service of you collecting some information so that that revelation process can occur, awesome. That's a wonderful thing. If it's just a vulnerability and you don't know where to get maybe uh, some input and advice, another beautiful reason to write that. But then watch yourself and see if what you're posting something for is, you could be like me. You could always want to be the first one there, or the first one in the contest after it's judged to be a contest, or you just like making brilliant comments. And those are all probably reasons to check and take a look at yourself so that you can move yourself back onto the I am, and the unraveling can then begin again. Because the minute that we move into the egoic, um, you're going to you're going to see, you're going to obliterate your own canvas of consciousness, as it were, and all you see is who you are, and the conditioning that lives under that, largely unconsciously and unseen, is now playing to get what it's always tried to get. And that's the razor's edge that we're all that we're all playing on. So, in my sense of things, I chose this particular chapter because it's the beginning place of what we're up to, which is the recognition of I am. And it's funny, he talks about um, in this piece how you always know that you were there in everything that's ever happened in the course of your life. And if you think back to any event, right? I was at my 5th birthday party and I was at my 72nd birthday party, and there's no difference in the I that witnessed that, right? Everybody has that particular experience. And so just knowing that piece is in there, the ever-present piece of who you are, and easily identified at any point in time by a history of years that knows that that's exactly who you are, this watching piece that has no change. You can say I was there, but if I asked you, I said, describe who that was there, you would stumble, and because it was just you were there, and there's a knowing that you were there. Everybody has that particular knowing, very easy to come by. And to someone who has not had at least the first revelation that I'm not the body or the personality or the story that encapsulates that body, right? Because that's typically what we do is we live in the story. We bring this energy of now into the story and then we live in it. So rather than living in the present, we live in a second class version called story. So, and by the way, you're going to hear me talk about how great story is and how wonderful it is. But remember, everything in duality is a double-edged sword. So story is really great until story's not great. So, and that's always duality. But if you think about me being present at all of the events during life, right? There's never been a change in that. The 5-year-old Alan and the 72-year-old Alan and all of the birthday parties in between, that being present at that event was always exactly the same and completely indescribable, right? And that's the starting place for, what it is that we're up to in terms of this. And then what happens is that um, in my mind, the holding that we do, Papaji was really famous for saying, "Be quiet and be quiet and come to satsang." That was his entire piece of wisdom, right? So that's the piece that now needs to play, right? However it is that that is created in your life, that's the piece that now gets to play. This is intended to be a possibility. If this works for the holding cell of the movement that you're making. And if not, then the piece that we miss, I think, in the non-duality as we see it out there is that there's not an accounting for the fact that process is like that. Now, somebody could say to me, "Hey, Alan, some people come and they don't need to be in this process." And they're right. Ramana Maharshi at 13 went and was in a cave and people would gather around him because he was in pure silence, and that's a wonderful thing. Um, but I would say normally, if you look at the different kinds of folks that have given us the wisdom that we're working with, like today, Nisargadatta had what, 10 or 12 beady shops in India and went on a journey and they all went broke and he came back and the one that was left, which is in the red light district of Mumbai, he decided that would support him for his life. And but he was well into his 40s by the time that he decided to do that. So he was a working man. He had a life where his process of sitting on the eye actually was held and facilitated. Ramesh, the same way. He retired from the Bank of India at 65 years old and found Nisargadatta and became his translator and gave satsangs at the end of his life. His satsang became the extension of Nisargadatta's. And there isn't a lineage, if you know, in the non-dual world. So to claim such is kind of a funny thing. But clearly those things did happen, and these folks, came out of the world that we came out of, which is they've lived a lifetime, and now they're in this particular world of knowing that there's something there, and working on trying to actually figure out what that is, and so that kind of seeking is what this is designed for, and it's also designed, that design leaks into how we deal with each other. So a lot of us will be, no matter where we are in the spectrum, are going to become teachers for those of us around us. And so understanding how to teach and hold, right, is an incredible gift for someone who may want to step into the process. So just remember that. And that's the piece that I wanted to really point out, because I think we're all Westerners here. Most of us are. I think I might have detected that I have one or two folks that come from the East. So the holding piece and how it's handled is actually in the DNA for those folks, lucky people. Americans, what we do is we hit our head against the wall until it flattens out to the point, I guess, that we can get that information in there, and then we get the picture. But that's how that works. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and open it up, and if there are any questions, I don't know if anybody has anything that they'd like to jump in and ask at this juncture. And I'm very informal, by the way. So if you want to interrupt me at any time, you always can. And come and go as you please. That's kind of the style. Again, Southern California, the 60s, that style. Yeah. So that's the conditioning over here. So um, anyway, is there any questions that are popping for anybody? Go for it.
I was wondering, Alan, if you have experienced or if it is the experience um, I have been told that, and I have myself had brief snippets of the witness, obviously, but then the witness behind the witness. That's interesting. It seems like that first witness that understands that this is not real, that this is, this experiencing is fun. It's a lot of fun, but I am not this, and that can be a huge shift. But then to have the a witness with witnessing the witness who is understanding that this is not,
Right.
you know.
Right. So first of all, whenever we launch into this, a lot of people use the term concept. They'll talk about concepts, and I don't do that. I use the term story because the experience of movement and consciousness has always appeared to me to be a very alive thing, which means that presence needs to be brought in. And when you say concept, and I don't know why, that feels like a dead thing that kind of has an outline around what it's on a piece of paper. It doesn't move or anything like that. So I'm gonna do that. So when we're dealing with pointers, which is what we're gonna do here, we're gonna kind of point towards something. Remember that the experience itself, right, is seamless. So the watcher that sees the watcher, the awareness of that's a one piece movement that has its own deepening, right? But what happens is when the questions are asked, the reason that there becomes those two things, right, is that you're creating a story to try to explain the difference between one place and another, and the best you have is your intellect to try to sort that out, right? So your intellect gets applied, you create a story, you're pointing back at it. So it's like you got all these people sitting on the deck of a pool, and they're discussing what wet is, right? And some smart ass like you or I walk up and we put our foot in the back of one of them and we basically push them into the water. Now, I'm here to tell you that all of that discussion and all of that intellect that was in the service of figuring out what wet is not even going to become close to the fellow who's actually in the water, because in that case, wet is, right? There's no need for the explanation or the pointer. They're in the water. So that said, the thing you got to remember is that when we talk about consciousness, and there's two ways that you see people play with this one. One is that they use consciousness, and there's consciousness at rest, right? And consciousness in action. So you might see already where I'm going with this one, right? So so the consciousness of I am, right, which is a watching position, is consciousness in action. The I am, even though the I am itself is not associated with a particular being, right? It is available to be associated in activity with a particular being or definition. So it's the precursor to the actual definition of the ego or the persona. That's where it is. So when people talk about watching from that particular standpoint and they use that term, then it's the watching from the active principle of consciousness itself. Well, all of that consciousness in action, right, emerges within, if you will, consciousness at rest. Now, Nisargadatta and Ramesh and folks like me, we don't like that definition because you're using consciousness in two ways, and that way, if you don't get, you don't, you know. So when I use consciousness, I'm talking about consciousness in action, and consciousness at rest, I use the term absolute awareness. Absolute awareness is the place of, that's your consciousness at rest. And that's the final resting place of all seeing, right? All watching, all perception. So when the comment is made, perceiving without a perceiver, right? That's at the level of absolute awareness. That's when the I am, remember I said sitting on the I am and the unraveling, the watching from the place of consciousness, and in that unraveling, eventually it will collapse, right? And that collapse then delivers the absolute awareness, the perception, what Nisargadatta would have called apperception, right? Perceiving with no perceiver. Okay, so that's how you break that down. Now, you mentioned having experiences, and of course I come from, remember Ramesh was a businessman, and so one of the things that he did, which I thought was the most lovely thing, was he coined a term for that. He called those free samples. Only a businessman would name these, awakening experiences as we go along as a free sample. So I always really appreciated that. The minute I heard it, I was like, this is cool. It's a language I understand. Free samples. I got this one. So, but that's the movement. And so that simply tells you, that the collapsing is happening, right? The collapsing is happening, and the free sample arises. Now, whether the watching collapses all the way into absolute awareness or it's simply a collapse within, consciousness itself, it is the location of oneself in the experience of consciousness arising, absent it arising from you, right? In other words, there is an experience of that arising as a wholesale piece of arising. And so that's what the free sample delivers. And that just simply tells you that the unraveling is happening. It's active and it's happening. And that's where that piece lives. Yeah. Yeah. I know in the beginning, we may halt through these things and there'll be space to have questions and everything. So, and I shouldn't have much of a problem helping you out. My grandfather used to say that I never met a conversation I didn't like. So if it feels like quiet's gone on for too long, I'll probably come up with something for us. But I don't find, I actually like to let it just sit for a minute and let people find their way in if they do have a little bit of a question. So.
So, Alan, once we get a sense of the I am, we get a little bit of that taste, but we're not ready to go out and preach the gospel, ready to teach the world yet because we haven't reinforced it. It sounds like yeah, all there is to do is to just keep sitting on the I am, reinforcing it, learning. And at some point, we'll go out and help and teach others. But for the time being, got to sit tight because I found myself that I've caught a glimpse and a taste of it, but I can slip out of it any given moment. It's kind of
Right.
like, "Ooh, have it, oh, it's gone. Is that kind of the general sense that you have of it as
It,
well?
it is. And remember that, one concept leads to another. So, or one story leads to another. So when you give the advice, sit on the I am, right? That sounds to all the world like I'm telling Tim to go sit on the I am. That sounds like a very dual or egoic kind of piece of advice. But the reality is once we work with this, we see that it all arises by itself, including the idea that I would be telling you to go do whatever and you would actually be doing it, or the reverse, right? In other words, what looks like those personal activities is just the cognition that you hold as an individual that tells you that it tells you that you are doing something. So of course the instruction or the pointer comes across, to begin with in that particular way. But what then begins to happen is that it's recognized that there's nothing happening and there's really nothing for you to do, right? But simply, right, be, you know, be arisen, so to speak. I'll come up, be materialized, manifested is the word I'm looking for. So thank you. So there's a recognition that this is all manifested by itself. And so the bottom line ultimately is that pure relaxation is awakening itself. In other words, it sounds like in the beginning that you would be responsible for creating this possibility of pure pure relaxation, but that actually is going to happen all by itself. So what's really cool is you're absolutely right. Within this period where the slippery slope is present, right? It's perfect until you look at your watch at 4:15 and you figure out for the last hour you've been lost in space, right? So you're like, I must have fallen off, right? I was riding my horse. The horse isn't here. I'm laying in the field. Must have fallen off. What else could it be? Because that's usually what happens. You don't notice when the falling off happens. You notice an hour or a day or what the hell it is later, right? And so, okay, I can back into this. I'm not where I was, and so there we go. But the ability, the messaging is that within relaxation, right, the slipping's going to happen, right? So being on the I am isn't an exercise of, oh my God, I'm not on the I am. I got to get my ass back there, right? It's more of a, oh, okay, kind of cool. It lasted, the falling off the horse only lasted an hour and 45 minutes. Isn't that great? Back on the I am. But that's all happening by itself. So one, if one is ready to basically live in that space, and the sooner you can be in that, the sooner that you feel that relaxation about what's happening start to occur, right? That's the beautiful place to be. I remember, that it was people would get really concerned when they were around Nisargadatta and Ramesh about when it is that awakening is going to occur, right? So they had to come up with ways, to kind of say, look, and so there are these stories and these sayings that they would come up with, and one of them you see in Ramesh's book. It's your head is in the mouth of the tiger. That's one. So Ramana would use that, and he'd say, look, we already know that where you are is your head's in the mouth of the tiger, and what we're waiting for is for the jaws to snap shut. And the reason that this was being told to a disciple, a seeker, was that it induced relaxation so that racing mind wanting to know when awakening was going to occur might subside, because it was like, oh, my head's in the mouth of the tiger, I got this, right? So that was one of the things. The other thing that Ramesh used to say all the time was, I'm not sure there's a difference between pure relaxation and awakening. So as the pure relaxation is making itself known, it's arising within, right? It gives the disciple this wonderful moment of not having to race around and say, when's the thing I'm thinking in my head going to happen? Right? It's like, well, if there's no difference between pure relaxation and awakening, and pure relaxation is my bathtub is filling with it, I'm going to just sit here and I'm going to wallow in it for a while. That's what I'm going to do with this one. It's intended to take the pressure off the mind that wants to know when something's going to happen. Right? Now, the problem with that, of course, is that that happening, and the free sample people, you recognize it immediately. But the one that does not get informed when pure relaxation or awakening happens is the one that's freaked out about when it's going to happen, right? So that conditioning, right, it stays in there, right? So you and I are always going to have this history that we had. We're kind of be the way, the way the mind collects the information on what it sees in an individual, that'll still be out there. The behavior is going to look all the same. There's a famous, the Nisargadatta was really well known for this because he was kind of a curmudgeon with a short temper. And so somebody would come in and they would ask a question, and his first response was, "That's the stupidest question I ever heard." Right? And then immediately he would laugh because there was just a recognition that his conditioned, this conditioned self had jumped in and gotten the first shot at the answer to the question. And that was absurd all in and of itself, right? And the whole room would laugh with him. In fact, I remember in one case, the fellow who was there said, "Yeah, I was thinking that, that was really a stupid question." So you can see where the conversations go, but the you that you are is likely going to, continue to happen. And for those that have wives or husbands, you can go to them at any time and they will describe how it is that you've retained all of those characteristics throughout completely. That all of that I'm talking about, it's still there and it's still emerging, and they see it every day. So, and as my wife often said, she's, "I don't get the point." And I go, "Well, there isn't a point. So, keep at it." Because if, as Ramesh used to say, if you're going to win the lottery, don't win it after you're awakened. There's no one left to appreciate it at that point, So, but anyway, that's that play between those two. So just remember, pure relaxation, and that what it is that is trying to emerge is already who you are. It's already in place. So a lot of times our seeking gets dedicated to finding something that we think wasn't there. Right? Have you ever noticed that? That's our answer to everything, right? I'm deficient in fill in the blank. I better go get some more of fill in the blank, right? That's about as, as conditioned as you can get it. So, and we get to the point where we do it with such knee jerk, right, that we don't even realize we're looking for something that we believe is not there, when in fact, what we're dealing with here is a coming home. Right. It simply is a moment of being who we really are. That's what's going on here. And so you just have to remind yourself when you see yourself launch off. I see people take Nisargadatta stuff and turn them into systems where you start here and here's how you progress to where you're going to be. And I'm always like, that's an attempt. Right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take Nisargadatta and improve him. And my advice to everybody is don't get into that business, because I think that's a dead bang loser. Because it just there is no quote unquote system that delivers you. Now, that said, there are some really great pointer sets, right, that will sometimes move you through. And if that's your style and that's what you like, then those are perfectly designed for you. But just be on the watch out for that, because in the spiritual world, it seems like anything that someone can get their hands on can be placed in a system, and you now have the opportunity for $695. That's if you send today, because if you wait till Friday, it's going to be $895. So $695 today only, and you'll have Nisargadatta's system. And I'm here to tell you that's again not what's going on. So but you also have to watch that in yourself, how we have the tendency to package something up and then try to feed it to ourselves. That's equally as insidious. So it's always the intellect if the intellect is in the position of unwinding, then those things always get outed, right? The unwinding happens and the revelation is made, and then one sits on the unwinding.
Just kind of piggybacking on what Tim said,
Yeah.
because he was talking about sitting on the I am, and there seems to be, I would say there's a space for that, where sitting in the witnessing place, it's like a first step, if you will, of seeing that you're not your mind, your thoughts or emotions, you're what is sitting, um, like at rest and watching all that is arising. And he was asking about kind of losing that connection to the witness and then kind of slowly bringing himself back to it once he realized that it was gone. That seems like one question about like what is that experience like? And then like the way you approached the answer was about it almost felt like non-autonomy, like pure relaxation. And
Yes.
so even though one rests in the I am, you can still be personally attached to that I am. And the letting go seems like it could happen at the I am or at the body mind level, which is the pure relaxation piece. So kind of like how that all ties in together, and if they're kind of, is there like a stepwise approach where it's like, first step would be to be able to actually witness everything that's arising, and then to understand that even the witness itself is not under your control. You're actually not witnessing, but it's arising as it naturally will. I'll let you take it from there.
No, and I think that and I tried to kind of build it that way in my answer. So I'm really glad you're getting us into a better definition of that, because the way that the unwinding of concepts work is that you inherit one concept, right, or story, and then immediately it serves its purpose, right? Well, once it's served its purpose, now it's the next thing. So for sometimes people will say, I can't get to that place where I even can, in essence, have an understanding of everything arising. I'm still here where it's me, and I'm sitting in the I am, and the witnessing has happened. And so the response at that level is stay right. You're doing it perfect. Stay right there, right? But then we know that, the next story that happens, right, is that there is the experience of it all arising together, just as you just pointed out. Well, when that happens, it's a lot like the Buddha story. You take your boat across the river. When you get to the other bank, don't carry it with you, jettison that thing, because you're no longer in a place where witnessing from the I am and feeling the personalness of that witnessing is still at play. You now have that story has dissolved, and now the one that has taken its place is this understanding of everything arising. Right. Now, what tends to happen is that, as there are a lot of other, if you wanted to actually build a set of micro steps, right, and go, okay, here's this concept that dissolves, here's the one that takes its place. This one dissolves, this is the one that takes its place. That's going to happen throughout the journey. I've just built it with two, which is the sense of autonomy and volition, and then the sense of none of that. But it doesn't. I mean, there are a lot of other pieces that unwind in the journey, and so it clearly can be done in that particular way. But it's always up to you to sense what's working. It's really always in your benefit to recognize where you are. So if what's happening is that the personalness is really there and the volition gets revealed every now and then, or it hasn't been revealed, that's okay, right? It's just like taking a drive to a city and you haven't arrived there yet. You're on the drive, right? So you have to make the drive to get there. So there is no acceleration that says, if I see it right, I will suddenly be in Los Angeles. No, your car has to get from here to Los Angeles, and then if you want to get out and enjoy Los Angeles, if you can, then you can do that. But I think that's a really well taken, a really well taken point, that that movement happens and that concepts arise, have a use, and then they're dropped. And so the one thing that really is, again, a double-edged sword, right? Stories and concepts and pointers are a double-edged sword. They live in duality. And so we have the nature of, I remember, I can't remember how old, I think I was 10 years old, and my mother comes down one day, and I have just decided to take 12 aspirin, right? And my mother says, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, Mom, the first time you gave me two, so the next time I took four, and you know what? It worked better. And the next time I took six, and you know what? It worked better." The way I'm looking at it is, baby, I'm riding this aspirin thing to home, wherever that is, right? And of course, my mother had to kind of explain that probably at 10 years old wasn't a really bright move, and I understood that. So the double-edged sword of this is to get in love with, to become in love with the what it is that has given you movement to the place that you are right now, and the dropping and the emergence of the new story or the new concept. A lot of times that's a hard one to get over, because we're really clear, hey, this one was really working. And so there just needs to be an understanding that, if the point, what the pointer is, if somebody says, hey, eventually there is a permanent shift, and within that permanent shift there is a permanent peace that arises and is always present, and the perceiving is from absolute awareness, you want to put it that way, or the perceiving with no perceiving, the apperception. We know that that's out there, right? So that pointer is just simply to try to help you. It's not to put you in a freak out about where you aren't, but it's to encourage you to be able to give up the concepts when they're not working, because there's another thing yet in store on the journey. That's what the pointers are telling you, right? So the double-edged sword, you defeat the double-edged sword by being willing to do that. One of the big ones, for instance, is the old Buddha saying, if you see me in the road, kill me, right? Well, think about how ego works, right? There's a recognition in the world of ego that those stories are entirely extracted, cognized, formed, and that they live that way. But then in the movement, there's a recognition that all that is in essence a made-up story. That's what I am. I'm a made-up story, and I'm acting as though that were the case, and as though I were an independent, volitional, autonomous being. That's what's actually going on here, right? So when that's happening, the next step is the actual, seeing that for what it is, seeing the illusion of that, right? Well, that's great, right? But seeing the illusion of that's not the end of the road, right? So that becomes the first step, right? And then now, and the other thing that happens, and Michael didn't really, and I'll just tell you this, and that is, my experience is that each individual journey is a journey in and of itself, so that the unraveling becomes relative to what it is that arises. So when Buddha talked about killing me on the road, what he was talking about were people that would fall in love with their guru to such an extent, right, that they could not imagine giving him up, him or her, which gave them this insane personalness in their connection to the guru. And that might have been the only personalness that was left, right? But it kept them glued. And Buddha was like, you see me in the road, destroy me. Now, how hard is that to say for Buddha? because he already knows that what's being destroyed isn't there anyway. Right? So the invitation is to destroy something that feels and for all the world looks real to you, but really has no existence anyway, right? So when you meet me, kill me, not a problem, right? Now, you can see that for someone that comes out of the Eastern side, the inclination to have a guru relationship at that level is probably a lot higher because it's in the culture and it's in the tradition. Whereas for those of us that come out of a Western style, the guru model really has never been part of our culture or history. And so that may not be the pointer you need. And that's what I was talking about, how every journey is different. So where some stuckness may be living likely is going to be in a different place for every journey. Now, the unwinding of that, believe it or not, is usually the same kind of unwinding in every case, but it just gets applied to the specific stuckness that's being dealt with in any kind of exchange. So just recognize that you know that when Michael talked when we're talking about micro steps, for some people one of those steps might be a big deal, and for another one of the steps ends up, yeah, it just depends on how the personality, how the stories are held within the personality, and how those particular steps, how they resonate and live, and how buried deep and unconscious they are. Because despite the fact that we're not doing the work ourselves, it seems like consciousness, when it does the work, that that where the stuckness is more pronounced, that more work seemingly needs to be done there. Now, I don't want to do a cause and effect thing there, but I'm just making that particular point.
I think one of the biggest pointers for me was when Nisargadatta said, understanding is all. And once I understood I'm not this body, there was such a huge relief to that. Now, I'm not saying that I have awakened totally or anything like that. I'm just saying that that huge relief of understanding, everything else just takes care of itself with that understanding.
Yeah, and Ramesh used to use the term living understanding, right? That was one of his. And what he was pointing out is that what happens is that within the body mind, the stories that are there run, right? They are living understanding. So the living understanding of a seeker in the beginning is that they're an autonomous decision-making individual, but what's happening is inside there is a piece of consciousness making the announcement every 5 seconds that you're not seeing something that needs to be seen. So what begins to happen is that you replace one living understanding with the next living understanding. So those living understandings actually roll as a reel inside of you, so to speak, right? And so the living understanding of a perceiver, or a perceived without a perceiver, that's this ultimate, if you will. But it's still, when you and I pass it back and forth to each other, right? You're going to have a living understanding there because we're a human body mind. Right. Ramesh, people sometimes would say, I sat here listening and I came to the conclusion, that all we needed to do is sit in silence. And Ramesh would say, I heard him say this 100 times, and I heard it once, but he would say, yeah, you're right, but you guys keep asking me questions, right? Because that's human, right? So no matter what you do, the human body mind is going to, produce stories, right? It's going to have this living understanding, and that living understanding is going to likely generate questions, right? So then the pointers get used to actually manage the installation, if you will, of that living understanding. Probably one of the most profound pieces I've ever seen written is, and we'll actually work with this. It's Pointers. It's the second book that or the first book that Ramesh wrote, called Pointers of Nisargadatta Maharaj. And this piece, it's one of the most profound pieces I've ever seen. Located as, I think, the second thing in the appendix. That's how important somebody thought it was. And you read this thing, oh my God. But what it is he said, here's the basic understanding, right? That piece in the appendix of that book is Nisargadatta's version of what the living understanding is. So if you ever want to read Nisargadatta's Living Understanding, go to Pointers, go into the appendix. I think it's called the basic. It's something along that particular line. So just so you know, but you'll see where that's very comforting to read that, because what that's part of the process of letting the new living understanding have this sway within the body mind. Yeah. Okay, I think we're good here. Let me just say a couple of things here before we cut everybody loose. I'm thinking of doing this one twice a month on Thursdays. And then we have a little contingent from Europe. And so I'm thinking about, and some people that don't want to do weekdays. So I'm actually thinking of doing a Saturday, maybe a 1 o'clock on the West Coast, 4 o'clock on the East Coast Saturday time, which would allow the Europeans to come. It'd be either 10 or 11 their time. And I'll do twice of those a month. I'll do 2 of those a month if there is a demand for all of that. So that's the go forward in terms of, I think, what we're thinking of doing. And so we'll get together and figure out when, kind of, we'll set the dates, and we'll put those out on the maybe the next 3 or 4 of them. We'll create dates and put those out there, and we'll be able to do that. And then another thing I'm going to do, just so you know, there is a beautiful documentary of Nisargadatta. It's one of the most beautiful. Some of you might have seen it if you haven't. I'm gonna get that posted on our page. I have it in Facebook. It's one of my Facebook saved videos. So I have not been able to access it any other way except through Facebook. Isn't that funny? So anyway, but because we have that page, I can post it on the page. It'll be available. It's about an hour and a half. And it was it was published by a small Indian production back in, I think, 2008 or 2009, and it's probably one of the neater biographies that you'll ever see, because biography of Nisargadatta not easy to come by. So I'll get that posted. And just so you know, we'll go into this more. But I wrote a book called Awakened Leadership some years back. I have a PDF of that. If anybody wants it, you let me know. It's kind of my personal process. I wrote a set of stories, and I was teaching leadership in the corporate world at that time, and I wanted to introduce non-dual concepts into that teaching. And so it's a story of this corporate guy trying to tightrope through that world while imprinting some non-duality into the teachings that were being generated. So it's a fun set of stories. So if anybody's interested in that, all you have to do is let me know on the wall, or you can send me an email, and I'll send a PDF. I just need your email, so I'll send a PDF out to anybody that wants that, and we'll make an introduction. We'll put that on the wall at one point so people can get that if they'd like to see that. I hope this hasn't been an information overload. It's our first one, so it was my only chance to get some of these things out, so and then what we'll do is we'll pick another chapter out of I Am That. And so my advice is, read the chapter, and if there's anything that's a sticking piece in that particular chapter, then that's the perfect moment to bring it in here so that we can all kind of have fun with it. So if as you read these pieces that we're going to work on, you'll likely feel that moment as you're reading, go, wait a minute. And if you have a wait a minute moment, those are the pieces that we want you guys to surface so that we can work with them in this particular format. And like I say, it allows you to come in, ask the question. No one's going to tell you, gee, you should have used absolute awareness and not consciousness at rest, or whatever it is that the Pharisees are arguing about this week. So, so I just really want this to be that kind of an environment, because there just isn't a reason for this. The one thing that, Nisargadatta, Ramesh, Papa, Osho, Robert Adams, you pick it, that was really established in this kind of a process, is that everybody is held with respect no matter where they are on the spectrum. And that has to be in there, or else what wants to emerge from which a response could be directed won't, right? Because who's going to walk into a chopping block? No one's going to do that. So the real basic piece here is that this is a place. So if folks that want to have that experience in dealing with their non-duality, a lot of them have taken it and have decided that it's a philosophic exercise, as a lot of what we do in life is in the West. But that's not what this is. Any final questions before we say goodbye?
I want to say thank you so much for putting all this together, Alan. We really appreciate you.
Yeah, I had a lot of help, and I've taught, as I say, for 25 years. So, and my style of teaching has been a lot more one-on-one, small groups, et cetera, which is where everything else. But there are a lot of people that really are just in love with the possibility. So it wasn't hard. I appreciate that you're thanking me, but you're actually thanking a whole big piece of consciousness, because that's what it took to have this happen. And a lot of people, with a lot of love, because if anybody thinks I could have done this on my own, stay 5 minutes late and I'll explain to you why that can't be the case. All right, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Much love. We'll see you in a couple weeks. We'll set that up, and by the way, the link will always be the same. It's in my personal room, so it's always the same. So if you keep the link, you're set.